The censors were asleep the night these TV horror movies aired. From ghostly possessions to demonic mirrors, these made-for-TV or broadcast horror gems from the 60s pushed far past the limits of good taste. Parents were outraged, critics were speechless, and some scenes still haunt midnight memories. Here are 12 TV horror movies from the 1960s that went way too far. Number 12, The Devil's Messenger, 1962. Before television learned to play it safe, The Devil's Messenger slipped onto NBC screens like a curse disguised as a crime drama. Produced by Roger Corman and directed by Paul Wenkos, this made-for-TV horror film blended biker violence, satanic manipulation, and spiritual dread in ways that felt wildly inappropriate for early 60s audiences. The story follows a charismatic outlaw who believes he has been chosen by the devil to carry out acts of murder on Earth. Unlike later possession tales, there is no spinning head or holy water theatrics. The horror comes from conviction. The biker doesn't question his mission, he embraces it. And as he drifts from town to town, leaving bodies behind, the film quietly suggests that evil doesn't need rituals, only belief. What shocked viewers was the tone. Leather-clad gangs, casual brutality, and open discussions of damnation were rarely allowed into American living rooms. Religious groups protested the implication that Satan could operate freely without divine intervention. Parents were disturbed by how calmly the violence unfolded without moral correction or punishment. Number 11, Night Slaves, 1969. Imagine waking up every night to discover your entire town is gone and no one remembers. That's the terrifying premise of Night Slaves, an NBC TV horror film starring James Franciscus and Lee Grant that crossed into paranoid body horror territory long before it was popular. Franciscus plays a man recovering from an accident who notices something wrong in the idyllic town he and his wife have moved to. Each night, the townspeople vanish only to return with no memory of their actions. What unfolds is a slow-burn invasion story where free will is stripped, replaced by hypnotic obedience and eerie conformity. The imagery of an entire population silently marching into the night remains one of the most haunting moments ever aired on 60s television. The movie plays with science fiction, but its true horror lies in the helplessness of isolation, the feeling of watching loved ones turn into strangers. Long before Invasion of the Body Snatchers hit color TV, Night Slaves was already exploring identity disintegration and emotional paralysis in a format accessible to every living room. The ending offered no clean resolution, just questions that gnawed at your sense of safety. It went too far, not with gore, but with fear that something sinister could already be controlling the world around you. Number 10, Daughter of Darkness, 1969. British horror slipped through the cracks in American broadcasting, and Daughter of Darkness is proof of how disturbing those imports could be. Originally aired as a BBC TV movie, it reached US screens via syndication, where its shocking subject matter caught audiences off guard. Set in a bleak Irish village, it follows a mysterious young woman named Emmy, who is accused of vampirism. Not the literal kind, but something far more psychological. She's obsessive withdrawn, possibly violent, and her presence leaves a trail of paranoia. The real horror isn't in blood or fangs, but in the overwhelming feeling that something deeply wrong hides in every shadow of her past. With a restrained visual style and deeply unsettling tone, Daughter of Darkness tapped into female isolation trauma and mental breakdown at a time when horror rarely looked inward. Emmy's twisted relationship with her father, her strange power over men, and the villagers' refusal to confront the truth made the film feel like watching an exorcism of real-world abuse. It was banned from several re-airings and edited on VHS, but the damage was already done. For those who saw it uncut, Daughter of Darkness wasn't just horror television. It was a whispered warning about the things society refuses to see. Number 9, Fear No Evil, 1969. NBC's Fear No Evil dared to go metaphysical. This eerie TV movie follows a psychiatrist played by Louis Jourdan, who investigates a cursed mirror linked to a man's terrifying death. What begins as psychological study descends into occult horror, filled with dream invasions, hypnotic nightmares, and an evil that exists beyond science. Unlike the monster of the week formula of the era, this movie leaned into dread. The mirror doesn't just haunt you, it reflects your deepest fears and uses them to break your mind. The visual of characters seeing their own deaths inside it stayed with viewers long after the screen faded to black. The hallucinations were shot with swirls of light and layered whispers, making it feel less like TV and more like a fever. The movie was intended as a pilot for a horror series called Bedeviled, which never aired, but the standalone film went viral in its time. Churches protested NBC's decision to broadcast occult material on a weeknight. Psychologists debated its subliminal influence. One viewer even claimed the mirror made her sleepwalk. It was sophisticated, chilling, and far ahead of its time. And it made one thing clear. Sometimes, the scariest demons are the ones we let inside. Number 8. The House That Would Not Die, 1968. When ABC aired this gothic horror TV movie starring Barbara Stanwyck, it marked a turning point. No longer content with eerie shadows and subtle chills, The House That Would Not Die dove straight into ghostly possession, ancestral secrets, and full-blown supernatural terror, all during primetime viewing. Stanwyck plays Ruth Bennett, who moves into a colonial house with her niece, only to uncover a violent past linked to a Revolutionary War general and a vengeful spirit. What begins with creaking floorboards quickly escalates into a terrifying seance where Stanwyck herself is possessed by a long-dead woman whose screams echo through the house. The possession scenes shocked audiences unused to seeing a silver screen legend convulsing and crying out in guttural voices on national TV. There is a moment where a seance spirals out of control and a character becomes paralyzed by unseen hands. That scene alone caused complaints and even letters from disturbed viewers. Critics dismissed it as typical ghost fare, but the realism and violence, especially for a made-for-TV production, left an undeniable impression. It was daring not just for what it showed, but for who was in it. Barbara Stanwyck being overtaken by dark forces gave the film unexpected weight. ABC had gambled on horror, and what they got was a movie so effective that it spawned a wave of similarly dark TV thrillers in its wake. The house may not have died, but for many young viewers that night, their sense of television safety certainly did. Number 7. Dark Legacy, 1962. In Dark Legacy from the thriller TV series, magic is no illusion. It is ritualistic, ancient, and terrifyingly real. This episode explored the descent of a stage magician into occult madness when he inherits his uncle's secret book of dark spells. Unlike other thrillers of the era which hinted at horror, this one unflinchingly walked into the abyss. The episode doesn't just flirt with satanic imagery, it dives into it. We watch the protagonist chant in Latin, draw blood symbols, and begin sacrificing animals in a dusty attic. His skin darkens, his eyes hollow out, and the transformation into something demonic happens slowly, disturbingly, inevitably. For early 60s television, this was shocking territory. What made Dark Legacy go too far wasn't just the imagery, but the tone. It treated magic not as metaphor, but as infection, spreading from mind to body to soul. At a time when networks avoided anything remotely blasphemous, this episode portrayed the dark arts as powerfully seductive and ultimately fatal. The final scene shows the magician consumed by flame, not through special effects, but through a hallucination so surreal, it left many viewers convinced it was real. The network received angry letters not only from parents, but from religious groups condemning the broadcast. The episode was nearly pulled from syndication, but survived because of Boris Karloff's involvement as host. It remains a chilling glimpse into how horror TV briefly opened the gates of hell and did not blink. Number 6. The Grim Reaper, 1961. The final image of the Grim Reaper haunted an entire generation. A painting with eyes that seemed to move, a creeping sense of doom, and a mysterious series of deaths in a haunted mansion. This episode from Thriller was classic gothic horror, but with a razor's edge. What made it legendary was how far it went in evoking real existential terror. Boris Karloff introduces the tale of a cursed painting that dooms everyone who owns it. The image of the Reaper itself is already unsettling, a cloaked figure with a skeletal smile, but the real horror begins when the deaths start. They are not flashy or bloody, but deeply psychological. One character dies of terror mid-monologue, while another is found face twisted in a look of pure dread. The atmosphere is relentless. Walls creak when no one is near. A cat screams in the night. Footsteps echo, but no one is there. By the time the painting is revealed to have unnatural origins, the audience is already trapped in the same mental spiral as the characters. For 1961, this was considered extreme. NBC nearly buried the episode, fearing backlash. Karloff fought to keep it. It aired only once during prime time, then vanished from reruns for years. Those who saw it never forgot the chilling final shot, the painting's smile seeming just a little wider. It was the kind of horror that bypassed censors because it wasn't about gore. It was about inevitability, and that made it terrifying. Number 5. The Jar, 1964. Nothing on network television should have been this cruel. The Jar, an episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, delivered one of the most emotionally brutal horror stories ever broadcast, and it did so without a single supernatural element. The plot centers on a grotesque carnival exhibit, a preserved human infant sealed inside a glass jar, advertised as a medical oddity. A lonely, childlike man becomes obsessed with it, treating the jar not as an object, but as a companion. He talks to it, protects it, loves it, and when the jar is damaged, his fragile sense of reality collapses. What made the jar unbearable was its intimacy. The camera lingers on the man's expressions: confusion, attachment, fear of abandonment. There is no relief, no irony, no twist that softens the blow. By the final moments, when his desperation turns violent, the horror feels almost accusatory. You are watching someone break, and the show refuses to look away. Viewers flooded CBS with complaints. Some affiliates refused reruns. Critics called it tasteless and emotionally sadistic. Hitchcock defended it, arguing that true horror came from human vulnerability, not spectacle. Number 4. The Cheaters, 1960. The Cheaters didn't need monsters to scare you. It gave you a cursed pair of eyeglasses. Airing as part of the Thriller anthology and hosted by Boris Karloff, this tale of greed, madness, and moral collapse centers on a strange set of spectacles that allows the wearer to see people's innermost thoughts, but at a price. Each segment follows a different character who stumbles upon the glasses. One is a washed-up actor who sees the contempt others have for him. Another is a greedy heir who watches relatives plot his demise. But worst of all is the slow, creeping madness that overtakes each person once the truth is no longer hidden. The eyeglasses strip away illusion, and what's left is unbearable. The final story of a desperate man going blind who forces the glasses onto his face ends in pure nightmare fuel, screaming bloodshot eyes and a spiral into insanity. Viewers in 1960 were not used to horror this morally bleak. It wasn't about redemption or evil villains. It was about how fragile our sanity really is when exposed to brutal truth. Several local stations refused to re-air it. Religious groups denounced it for spiritual blasphemy. But for a generation of horror lovers, it became iconic. The horror of self-awareness told with eerie precision. The Cheaters didn't jump out of the dark. It simply whispered that you already know what's wrong, and now you can't unsee it. Number 3. Pigeons from Hell, 1961. When Pigeons from Hell aired on Thriller, it didn't just scare audiences, it scandalized them. Adapted from a Robert E. Howard short story and set in a decaying southern plantation, this was no mere ghost story. It was voodoo gothic terror wrapped in racial unease, family murder, and reanimated corpses. The title may sound odd, but the imagery was unforgettable. A flock of pigeons bursts from the rafters like a warning. Two brothers find shelter in an abandoned house only for one to wake up with an axe in his skull and the other accused of the crime. But the house itself is possessed by ancestral guilt and dark magic. When a zombified sister wanders into the room, her eyes lifeless, her mouth chanting, it was too much for many viewers. The zombie is not your Romero creature. She is slow rotting and inescapably tragic. Her presence is a condemnation of old sins. Add to that the inclusion of black magic rituals, blood sacrifices, and themes of incestuous revenge, and it's no wonder Pigeons from Hell sparked letters to networks. In the American South, some affiliates reportedly cut the final segment entirely, but it stands as one of the boldest pieces of 60s horror ever aired on TV. With deeply unsettling atmosphere and racial metaphors hidden in the moldy walls of a crumbling mansion, it did what few dared. It made Southern Gothic horror feel truly cursed. Number 2, The Eye, 1960. This pilot episode from the Way Out TV series was never supposed to air to a mass audience, but CBS ran it in prime time and instantly regretted it. The Eye tells the story of a man whose eye is destroyed in an accident and receives a transplant, only to find that he now sees everything through the emotions of the donor, and the donor was a murderer. At first, it's subtle. The man looks at his wife and sees her as an enemy. Light flickers where there is no bulb. people's faces distort in mirrors, his nightmares turn violent. The horror is not in what he sees, but how he begins to lose control over his own mind. In one iconic scene, he lashes out at a friend, convinced he's about to be attacked, only to discover it was all in his imagination. Or was it? The episode ends with a close-up of his face contorting into madness, screaming into a mirror as the camera spins in a dizzying shot that still feels experimental today. Viewers complained of nausea, nightmares, and anxiety. CBS executives were flooded with protest calls, and yet critics were split. Was it brilliant horror or irresponsible broadcasting? Number 1. Dead of Night, 1969. Dead of Night came late in the decade, but its final act burned itself into pop culture forever. A British anthology film aired on American television. It featured 3 tales, but one stood above the rest. The Ventriloquist's Dummy, starring Michael Redgrave, was pure nightmare fuel. The story follows a ventriloquist whose dummy begins to speak to him in voices he can't control. At first, it seems like mental illness, but as the story spirals, the dummy develops its own personality, manipulates others, and drives the man into psychotic breakdown. The horror here was intimate. No monsters, no gore, just psychological decay and a haunting message. Maybe the dummy was never the puppet after all. In one iconic scene, the ventriloquist wakes up to find the dummy whispering in his ear in the dark. The camera pans slowly, revealing both of them smiling, and only one smile looks real. American TV audiences were not ready for this. Children who watched it on late-night airings reportedly had weeks of nightmares. Some psychologists even used it in fear response studies in the 70s. Though tame by modern standards, the pure dread it evoked and the blurred line between possession and madness made Dead of Night the most effective horror television ever broadcast in the 60s. It went far, not with spectacle, but with suggestion, and that made it unforgettable. Those were the TV horror movies that slipped past the censors and scarred a generation. If these haunted your childhood, let us know in the comments. And if you want more lost horror from the shadows of retro television, hit that like button and subscribe for weekly dives into cinematic darkness.